looks like it's
Yeah,
working.
it is.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming. I'm here to talk about the High Performance Development Standard, which has been several years in the making for the City of Ottawa. We also refer to it as the HPDS, so I may use them a little bit interchangeably as I speak. The goal of the HPDS is to advance sustainable and resilient design as set out in our official plan, which is the city's sort of master planning document. We're aiming to achieve net zero emission construction and meet citywide greenhouse gas emission reduction targets by 2050. The HPDS will come into effect for new site plan and plan of subdivision applications upon approval of the new official plan. And so this is sort of, I'm going to go over the specifics of it. So I'll start with a bit of a background of what the HPDS is, what our targets are from a climate change perspective at the city, and then go into some of the more general process pieces and go into the energy modeling requirement, which is our site plan requirement, and then our community energy plan, which is our plan of subdivision requirement, and then cover some of the non-energy related metrics. So essentially, it's the High Performance Development Standard is a collection of voluntary and required metrics that define sustainable and resilient design for the City of Ottawa. And it's reviewed through the development review process. And when we're talking about sustainable and resilient design, that's covering a holistic number of features. So energy efficiency being one, but also health, safety, green, accessibility, livable, all those kinds of features. So we modeled the High Performance Development Standard after the Toronto Green Standard, which was adopted in Toronto back in 2006. And it's been a practice that's been adopted by a number of other municipalities across Ontario over the last several years. Don't think this has been, we haven't updated this since Ottawa Standard went forward, but there have been a couple of others that have come after us as well. So there's lots of municipalities working on this piece. So in order to get to council approval and council adoption of the High Performance Development Standard, there have been a number of activities along the way. The first sort of early steps were back in 2015, developing renewable energy strategy, which later transitioned into becoming Energy Evolution, which is the city's greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. In 2019, Council declared a climate emergency. In 2019, and then later in 2019, Council adopted the Climate Change Master Plan, which approved the Council setting new GHG reduction targets in line with the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change. And then in 2020, they approved the final Energy Evolution Strategy, which led the framework for the High Performance Development Standard. So the High Performance Development Standard is enabled by both Energy Evolution and our new official plan. So then the next step was our new official plan getting approved by Council in 2021 and was later approved by the province late last year, so in November of last year. In 2022, we brought forward the High Performance Development Standard, which set out the voluntary and required metrics. Are expected to come into effect by July 1st of this year. We have a report to committee and council coming. We're going to committee on Tuesday next week. So that will all get locked in if approved then. So the city's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets on the community side, we're looking at 100% reduction by 2050 with pretty strong targets back in 2040 as well. So lots of work to be done to align with the IPCC 1 degree Celsius temperature rise of GHG emission reduction targets. And then on the corporate side, pretty similar with the exception that we're aiming to be a little bit stronger, faster in that it's 100% reduction by 2040. And those targets were informed by the energy evolution model, which modeled out various pathways and various activities to see how we could get to that level of emission reductions. The high performance development standard focuses on new buildings and how we're informing new buildings in particular, which are expected to make up about 8% of our emission reductions on the community side. So just one small piece of the puzzle. The City of Ottawa has worked with the National Capital Commission on climate projections as well. So just projecting what we should be expecting and be preparing for in light of various average temperature rises. So this graphic here demonstrates the high carbon emission scenario. So that's about an 8.5-degree global temperature rise, but it gives you a sense of what we're expecting to see. In short, it's warmer, wetter, wilder, and we're already seeing the impacts and effects of that over the last several years. So the legislative context for the high performance development standard, so it's enabled through the Planning Act, which is municipal authority. And so the Planning Act sets out what the city is allowed to mandate through site plan control and plan of subdivision. And then our official plan is the overarching planning document, which sets the direction for those. And then the high performance development standard is where we get into the specifics of what we're really asking for and how. And it's both, there's a combination of mandatory and voluntary components within the high performance development standard. My presentation today is going to focus on the mandatory component only, because we don't yet have an incentive program for the voluntary component. That will be coming. I will be engaging on what that should look like over the next year or so. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I will do my best. Probably also I was pointing a little bit this direction, so I'll try and be a little bit more forward facing. So Ottawa's new official plan had 5 big moves. Within that, there were several that impacted climate change, specifically resiliency was a big one. So embedding environmental and climate and public health resiliency into the policy framework. So that's what was approved by the province late last year. Within the official plan, these are sort of, this is just a high-level reference of what the policy directions are, just for, I can share this PowerPoint afterwards if you want to read up on what the details in the official plan are for the direction we've received. But this is just kind of for reference. So when does the high performance development standard apply? So it doesn't apply to projects that are building permit only. Tier 1 has mandatory measures that apply to site plan control in the urban area for all applications, site plan control in the rural area for complex applications only. So that's for residential, that'd be over 14 units, just to give you a sense of size. And it also applies to plan of subdivision, all new applications. Effective July 1st of this year is what's being proposed to council later this month. Tier 2 is encouraged and completely voluntary. And for city projects, we've received direction as part of the high performance development standard to align our update to the green building policy for corporate projects with Tier 2 of the high performance development standard. So trying to show leadership in that direction as well. So as I mentioned, in terms of rollout, the high performance development standard is expected to come into effect for new applications July 1st of this year, and its review and approval is by the planning services lead. So it's part of your site plan application process. And full compliance is required unless sufficient justification is provided. The building energy efficiency metrics are not mandatory. The thresholds within them are not mandatory until January of 2024. So they start with a report only requirement before we start mandating what the performance thresholds are. And then the projection is the HPDS will review and update every 4 years or so to keep it current and keep things moving forward towards that 2040, 2030 target. So in terms of the updates, the energy targets in particular are expected to kind of iterate over time and improve over time. So this sort of demonstrates in 2022, we're starting with tier 1 as the mandatory piece. And then we're expecting for the first versions, tier 2, to become the second versions, tier 1, and then so on and so forth to get towards zero emission buildings for new construction by 2030. So just in terms of the review process, so the file lead is the main point of contact for the high performance development standard for you on the submittal side. Internally, we have CCR, so the Climate Change and Resiliency team is there for supporting with revisions and advising on deviations and those kinds of things. And then the applicant is responsible for providing that complete documentation. So when I do this presentation remotely, I have a little online poll thing, so we can just do a verbal poll, see if you guys are listening or able to hear me. So you can just do a raise of hands maybe. What development applications are required to comply with the high performance development standard? A, it's voluntary. Any takers on A? B, it's all site plan and plan of subdivision applications. C, it's site plan and plan of subdivision applications except in the rural area. Or D, it's site plan and plan of subdivision applications except small sites in the rural area. Or E, it's site plan and plan of subdivision applications except small sites. So anyone want to shout out? D. Correct. Okay, good. I'm at least speaking. It was D. So here are what the metrics are. So for site plan, we have an energy performance requirement. We have 2 health-related requirements, 4 ecology requirements, 2 resiliency pieces, 1 thing relating to waste, and then 2 metrics relating to mobility. I'll go into each of these in more detail later, but just sort of gives you a sense of what we're covering. For plan of subdivision, we have 3 metrics total, so it's much simpler and lighter. So the main thing being the community energy plan, which is aimed at addressing energy and also resiliency of that energy. And then we have 2 metrics related to ecology. The way I've structured the presentation, I'll flag for you when I'm speaking to something that's for both site plan and plan of subdivision. So it'll be flagged throughout because I've kind of embedded them because the tree planting and plant species metrics are the same for site plan and plan of subdivision. So rather than repeating them twice, I thought I'd just embed it all together. So the requirements are set out, but we do allow for deviations. There's all sorts of potential scenarios that we haven't necessarily addressed in all of the requirements. So there's a process for that. It's basically just a deviation request form where you're identifying how you're proposing to deviate, how that deviation is addressing the intent. I'm still too quiet?
No. It's my fault. I put this right in front of the TV.
Oh, you can't see me.
Right.
So sorry. No worries. So now the next piece, I was going to jump into the energy efficiency metric for site plan. So before I do that, maybe I'll just pause. Are there any questions on like what the standard is, the authorities to implement it, those kinds of pieces before I move forward? Yeah. Yeah, totally understand. Yeah. Well, we'll go through, and the non-energy pieces are at the end. So if we don't get to it, we don't get to it. If there's lots of questions. So the objective of the building energy requirement for site plan is to, through exterior measures and early design decisions, reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with the operations of new buildings. So the energy targets, we have the first step in sort of the hierarchy of energy performance. Just as a bit of a review, this is likely familiar to many of you, is the first step is reduced energy loads through passive design. So encouraging higher quality building envelopes and improving resilience through that higher quality envelope. The next step is improving efficiency of mechanical and electrical systems, so more that systems level approach. And that's measured through the total energy use metric. And then the last step is connecting to low carbon energy sources. So that's measured through the greenhouse gas emission intensity target. And then I'll go through kind of the high level concepts of why we're trying to inform this early on in design. And I'm sure some of this will be repeat and familiar to you. So I'll try and go through this relatively quickly. So form is one major component that's just dictated at that site plan stage and in that early planning design stage. And form plays a big role in the heat loss of buildings. I think the natural world example is a really easy way to visualize why that is. The more articulation and more complexity to the building, the more opportunities for heat loss and more expensive it is to provide good insulation. Insulation is the next key component to the thermal demand piece, and particularly in our cold climate. So more insulation takes up space. So that is either impacting where your exterior of your wall is, or eating into your floor space. So those are the kinds of early decisions that should be part of the design conversation at site plan, and why we want to be having the requirements through that site plan control piece. The next is thermal bridging. So does everybody know what thermal bridging is here? Room full of engineers, good. Don't need to go into details on that, but examples of why it should be looked at and considered early on is considering what your building overall is going to look like, whether or not you'll have fins or architectural details being requested through various processes, or whether or not you'll have balconies. All those things will impact the ability to address thermal bridging. It's not to say you can't do any of these things. It's just to say it impacts cost and impacts how you might want to do them. So that's why it's important to think about all this stuff early and have those targets in mind early on in the process. The next major piece is window design. So window orientation, window to wall ratios, number and form of windows, exterior shading devices. Those are all site plan pieces, but window performance does get dictated later on in design when you're getting into your specifications. But these are the kinds of decisions we're looking to influence early. Orientation, oftentimes orientation is dictated by the site you're getting, but that doesn't always have to be the case. This is a key example by Windmill Developments here in Ottawa, where they've adjusted their majority of their windows to maximize that solar heat gain potential. Okay, so these are just visuals of the sort of concepts. So window design, number and form. So really thinking about how we're designing these, whether they're punch windows. You can see huge improvements just by changing how you are impacting the windows, or how you're designing the windows, even if it is the same total glazing area. Exterior shading to improve the passive thermal design performance. And then next kind of big concept is this airtight construction. So articulation and architectural embellishments, overhangs, all these things are, they don't prevent airtight construction, but all of them are considerations for the ability to achieve a good airtight construction, which that then impacts the building's energy performance. And then the next piece is the mechanical design. So early on at site plan, you probably don't have all of the details of your mechanical design, but there are kind of bigger picture concept pieces that are starting to be thought about, such as, are you going to do a geothermal loop system? And what will that mean to where you're putting your mechanical system and what your occupiable space is, both vertically within the building, and all of those can impact your site plan application. For the building energy efficiency metric, we do exempt projects that are below what we call the HPDS development threshold, which is non-complex applications. So that for residential buildings, that's under 14 units. And for commercial buildings, I forget what the size is off the top of my head, but I don't have it in my notes here. I apologize, but that kind of gives you a sense of the size of the buildings we're talking about that would be exempt. And then it's also not required for any buildings that are not required to have energy performance requirements under the Ontario Building Code. So farms, heavy industrial, temporary use buildings, those kinds of buildings. And any buildings not subject to the site plan control are not subject to the high performance development standard. So we allow for a variety of different performance pathways under the building energy metric in the high performance development standard. The first is the prescriptive approach, so similar to what we see in OBC SB 10 and ASHRAE 90.1, Energy Star, those kinds of pieces. Reference, we have the reference building approach, so that'd be the modeled approach. That is what we have for option 2 in the high performance development standard, energy performance metric. And then there's an absolute performance target approach, so more like Passive House or the Toronto Green Standard, which is option 1 in the high performance development standard. For the prescriptive approach, we do also allow for a certification commitment as an alternative pathway. So here's what the metric is. So essentially there's 3 pathways. One is to comply with total energy use, thermal energy demand intensity, and greenhouse gas emission intensity targets for the building. The table will be on the next slide. Or it's a 25% carbon emission reduction beyond the Ontario Building Code SB 10, and we'll update accordingly when there's new iterations of the Ontario Building Code. Or the third option is commitment to pursue certifications such as Energy Star for MERBs, LEED, or BOMA with a minimum number of energy points. So the documentation, the applicant's required to fill out the HPDS checklist and provide the energy modeling report. The file lead, which is who's receiving that on the city end, will be including the energy modeling requirement. If it's not provided at site plan application, we do allow for it to be a condition of approval. So you can push it out a little bit further. So you don't necessarily, we understand that the early submission at site plan, you don't necessarily have all the details. So it can be a condition of approval that then is checked prior to clearing your conditions and moving on to your building permit stage. And then we have a third-party review process. So the file lead is working with the consultant from our standing offer list to have the energy modeling report reviewed. So this is the TEDI, the total energy use, thermal energy demand, and GHG emission intensity targets. So that's what they are. We have them for multi-unit residential buildings, office, and retail. And then for anything outside of that, you would use a comparison to a reference building as the approach. And then this is what the checklist will look like in terms of how it's what's required to be submitted. The targets are provided on the checklist for easy reference. The applicant would provide the floor areas, which would, and then provide the energy use, the thermal energy demand, and the greenhouse gas emissions. And then the form would calculate what the intensity targets are, or intensity numbers and targets are. And so the form will automatically kind of review it. And if it's green, you're meeting the requirements. And if it's red, you're not. The next option is the 25% below carbon emission reduction. So again, you're inputting the carbon emissions for the proposed building, the reference building, and then the form will calculate what percent improvement you're seeing. And then the third option is commitment to pursue a certification standard. And so we have a list of the certification standards here. If it's other, you'd have to provide some justification of why that standard that hasn't been reviewed would be acceptable or should be acceptable. Yeah, for lead, we're asking, we haven't mandated a level, but we have asked that you identify what the minimum energy points that you're pursuing are. Yeah, so I'm pausing. So this is my pause for questions. So if you're providing if you're pursuing the reference building, like you're thinking for the prescriptive SB10 approach or for the modeling approach. Okay. So because it's a condition of site plan approval, you could have it just be the same report because you're sort of clear your condition. And then if assuming nothing's changed in the time that between when you've submitted your, and you have all the details, clear your condition, and then submit that same report to the building code services.
Design is not complete for a SB10 model. SB10 model might not be exact. So if there's a percentage change, city would not have an issue with that, I'm assuming.
Yeah, as long as you're hitting the target, it's not a problem. You can have a little bit of change. It's sort of similar to at other stages in design. You submit for your permit, there still might be some changes that happen during construction, and you're just sort of clearing those to make sure you're still hitting the design intent. So that would be okay.
From an owner's perspective, the time that the city would take to review these new processes, site plan already very long in the city of Ottawa. Is that going to add another month, another long period of waiting for it?
No. So the energy modeling portion in particular, it's a condition of approval for site plan. So you can have your site plan approved before you've submitted your energy model. It's just clearing your conditions. So it's outside of the site plan approval timeline. And the review process, we were expecting it to be a 2 to 3 week kind of turnaround of when you submit for your energy modeling report to when it gets kind of stamped and the condition is cleared and you can move on to building permit stage.
I don't. Is that it can be conditional to the site plan agreement registry?
Yeah. So that has been a relatively recent change. Initially, it was going to be, well, if you're on the planning side, you're aware there's been a lot of changes in planning processes as of late. So we've been looking at how it's going to be like how we're fitting into the new Bill 109 processes and all those pieces. And so part of aligning with the new Bill 109 requirements and the new mandatory response period for site plan approval, that's part of why it was moved as to be a condition. So yes, there's going to be communications on that, but we're still a little bit early because it has been a sort of more recent decision that was changed to that.
At the site plan, you know, the mechanical systems really have not been, traditionally have not been designed fully at that point. So you said you could, at the site plan, you could fill out the HTTS checklist and an energy report, which I guess is a narrative of what you're planning to do. For the, and then you could follow up with the energy model after that. So for the HPPS checklist, I noticed there were some energy values you did have to punch in there.
Yeah.
How is if the, again, if the.
We don't have the
model is
details.
not ready yet, how is the applicant to fill out those numbers?
Yeah, so if you don't have the details yet, it'll just be a sort of a narrative that's provided of like what the general intent and plan for energy is. So, you know, what pathway you're planning to do, whether it's certification or intensity targets or reference building, and, you know, highlighting what features you're planning to put in, but not necessarily locking you into anything. So that's what's required at application, is just that narrative piece. You don't have to provide the details of the numbers. And then it'll be a condition of site plan approval to provide the final the energy modeling report. And then as part, and the filled out checklist. So when you go to clear your conditions, you would fill out that number section at that time and provide the report, the detailed report.
Site plan conditions, again, not contingent on receiving site plan approval.
Right.
What you just said, but I would assume contingent on a building permit.
Yeah, so you have to clear your conditions before you move on to the building permit stage. Yeah. What do you, I guess, look, maybe a question. What do you mean by after? Yeah. You can change it as long as you're still meeting the metric. So yeah, there is flexibility. But I guess for awareness and what the owner might be a little bit concerned about is like the site plan process is a public process. So if you're saying something, you're saying it and the public knows that, and if you're a sale, like let's say it's a building that's going for sale, there might be some of your buyers who are buying into that, and then you have to deal with that communication piece. So that could be a challenge, but we're not holding it to it. Yeah.
Do the standards? It's not really like, if we're meeting the standard, is that gonna be included in the public regulation?
So the public circulation is happening at the site plan stage, so you're probably not gonna have the model
Yeah.
submitted yet. So it'll just be that paragraph that you're providing of like what you're saying, you're
That
kind of,
would be-
yeah. You look like you're wanting to, no. Okay. So I'll move on to the community energy plan part of the discussion. So the goal and reason we are requiring community energy plans is to enable these zero carbon solutions at the community scale. So how we have all these things kind of working together of the detailed designs, the utility plans, and the community energy plan. So that's the reason why we think the community energy plan is a really important piece of the process. So exterior energy features that are being thought about, but perhaps not defined at the subdivision stage are, what are your energy sources? What's your lot orientation, your site layout, those kinds of things. And then, so why you need to kind of think about that, the community stage. So if you're thinking about passive house as your solution, your lot width you might want to adjust your lot width to accommodate different wall thicknesses for that higher level of insulation. And questions of, are the utilities right sized? Are you feeding into that electricity utility process early enough to make sure that you're going to be able to hit your demands and those types of things for future electrical demand? Because typically these utility plans have been based off of past energy consumption, but if we're changing the way we're building, it's important to make sure we're communicating that and having that integrated process. So the overall objective is to support that community transition to the low carbon future and for the new community designs. So if we think about it kind of in comparison to the official plan as like a kind of a proxy, the planning process, we have Ottawa's official plan as the overarching plan for the whole city. Then we have local plans and community design plans that speak to individual neighborhoods. And then we have plans of subdivision that speak to the sort of neighborhood level. And then you get into the more specific of the building plans. So to liken that to the energy plan process, for the overall city, we have the municipal energy plan, which is our energy evolution strategy. At the local plan level, you'd have a community energy plan for the whole new community. And then you'd have a community energy plan or community energy plan brief for that subdivision stage to show how you're connecting with that local plan level. And then you'd move into like that building energy model report. So it's that sort of that nesting approach, sort of similar to that land use planning. And can you read this? This is a bit small. I'm sorry for that. So when is a community energy plan required? So they're required for local plans, secondary plans, and plans of subdivision. We have two levels of community energy plans. We have community energy plan reports and we have community energy plan briefs. So this is a decision tree that kind of walks you through figuring out when community energy plan might be required. So there's sort of size thresholds and those sorts of things. And so that's what that's kind of trying to communicate. So if you're a plan of subdivision, if you're a plan of subdivision that has a local plan level community energy plan, which you're probably not going to have for a number of years, you just have to provide a brief that communicates how you're aligning with the bigger picture level. If you're in an area that doesn't have an overarching community energy plan, then you either choose to do a modeled pathway or a prescriptive pathway. If you're doing the modeled pathway, you'd have to provide a complete report. If you're doing the prescriptive pathway, you'll just have to provide the community energy plan brief. And I have a slide further on that goes into the differences between the plan report and the plan brief. So that's coming. The sort of general process for community energy planning is first assess what the needs of the community and impacts of the development are expected to be, figure out propose strategies to mitigate those impacts and what your individual building level targets or those types of things might be, and then submit for approval. And then within the plan, there's a monitoring and implementation requirement where the person writing the plan would identify how they're planning to make sure it gets built out over time. So I'll go through this quickly. So yeah, go ahead. The approaches for building energy performance. So we have a prescriptive option, which is in the Appendix A of our terms of reference. And that's, I'll go through that later. The performance pathway, we have a reference building approach or reference community approach, or there's an absolute performance target approach. So it's sort of similar format to the building level. So the contents of a CEP, oh, I meant to delete this slide. So the contents of a CEP, we have a description of the development, existing context. Are there any energy sources you could be building off of or making use of? What are the objectives? Who are the partners? So might be multiple builders. You might partner with a district energy provider, those sorts of things. Data sources and methodology, that's pretty self-explanatory. Consultations and joint working groups. So for reports, we require that the applicants endeavor to work with the local utilities to have this be a report that or a plan that everybody's buying into and understanding what the implications of it are. And then you have the energy use and carbon emission scenario. So that breaks down into what's the proposed scenario, how you're planning to achieve the requirements, any analysis of emissions targets. So that's only required if you're doing the reference building approach. What the analysis is with respect to energy resiliency, are there concerns for energy resiliency in the community and how are you mitigating those concerns? And then implementation and monitoring. So that might be through agreements between, if you have multiple builder partners, you might have to set out what agreements there might be between partners. It could be implementation and monitoring, could be also a commitment to pursue a certification pathway to make sure the buildings are having that measurement and verification component through the construction phases. So the targets and scenarios, so if you're doing the modeled pathway, there's sort of 3 scenarios to evaluate, and then you provide your proposed scenario. So you're sort of going through what the different options are and then defining what your site's going to look like. There isn't a specific threshold that you have to meet, but the general intent is to demonstrate how by 2030 the community could begin transitioning to net zero emissions. And subdivisions have pretty long build phases. So that should be kept in mind through the energy planning process of how the building designs and plans will change over time and evolve over time. The prescriptive pathway, there's the option to just use the same intensity numbers as the site plan level. There's a commitment to a certification, or there's a commitment to including 2 of the following the energy conservation measure packages. So the prescriptive pathway can be quite simple. So this is an either or from this list for the prescriptive options. And then that's it for the community energy plan sort of slides I have. So I'll pause here for kind of questions or that kind of stuff. Yeah. So we do provide references from our projections so the City of Ottawa did climate projections that are very detailed. They include future cooling degree days and heating degree days, all of those kinds of design future scenarios. We aren't mandating that you model all of the future scenarios. That would be a lot of effort, and I don't know that you would get the full benefit. But the resiliency section is asking, look at what the projections are, and then consider what your risks are for your individual site, and then communicate how you're planning to mitigate those risks. So it's not a full analysis requirement for the future to sort of degree days or those types of scenarios, but we do provide the references and ask that it be looked at.
SP10 times. If you're doing the modeling for SP10, you're normally required to have 2 models, right? So if you're doing the GHG path, you'll need the model, the SP10 reference, your standard SP10 building, and then your building.
No. So the SB10 references are typically in relation to the reference building approach. So if you're doing the reference building approach, you're demonstrating above and beyond SB10. So well, I guess if you're doing the reference building approach for your permit application, you might need to have 3. Well, yeah, you would need to have 3. You're right.
Don't see many people.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll see what the route will be. I think on the community energy plan side, my expectation is most places will pursue a prescriptive approach, with exceptions of communities that are planning on looking at district scale solutions and really, would have been having to, if not formally create a community energy plan, go through that process anyway to inform what their district solutions are. So example of that would be like the Zibi site in Ottawa that, they never submitted a community energy plan to the city, but I imagine they went through some analysis of how they were doing their district energy system. Oh, we're back.
There
So from here, I get into the non-energy metrics. I think you had said planning to break at 1. I was sort of expecting to be here around 1. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So yeah, I guess whatever's, I can either dive in or we can pause now, whatever is most useful for the group. Okay. 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 So the non-energy metrics, so the first one, actually, this sort of might not seem like it would impact mechanical engineers, but it certainly could. It's an accessibility requirement. And so there's 2 components of it. You have to make sure the public entrances of the site are accessible for all users. So you're not directing those with accessibility devices to an auxiliary entrance in order to access the building. And then the second piece is minimizing interruptions along paths of travel and designing of grates embedded in the ground to meet size thresholds. And so that's to ensure that we're not interrupting accessibility devices. And then outside of travel, we have size threshold requirements as well, and that's to address the bird safe design requirements. So there are minimum or maximum opening sizes for the design of grates. So that would be if you have a underground parking garage and have to have fresh air intake or exhaust embedded into the ground, designing of those to make sure you're meeting the requirements. So the checklist for site plan accessibility, it's just a description of how you're addressing the primary entrance and public entrance requirement. And then identifying on your plans, you would identify where your buildings are and where your main entrances are and how they're accessible. Note on this is the public entrances requirement. Their individual suites would be exempt from this requirement, so it's only speaking to public entrances and specialty use entrances like loading bays and those types of things are also excluded. For the grate design, it's identification of where your grates are expected to be and, committing to those maximum grate dimensions. This can be demonstrated through just a notation on the plans of like on your landscape plans or your site plan of where they're expected to be and what because those things can change through this from the site plan process to the final designs, but it's about thinking about that early and planning your site so that you're minimizing the interruptions on path of travel as much as possible. The next item is the fresh air intake. So this speaks to addressing minimizing impacts of car pollution for major roadways on where you're inputting your where you have your fresh air intakes. And again, this isn't the expectation here isn't that you are telling us exactly where your fresh air intakes for the building are going to be. It's identifying where the possible locations are to inform that detailed design stage. So if you're within high volume traffic roadways, majority, so your high volume traffic roadways, majority will be in that over 15,000, but under 50,000 vehicles per day. If your building is within 100 meters of a high traffic roadways that falls into that category, then you have to be identifying how you're addressing how you're mitigating the fresh air intake from car pollution. And so protection options include natural air pollution buffers that can be done through landscaping. So if you're planning to have it be your fresh air intake be at ground level at the roadway, sort of right beside the road, you might want to buffer it through the landscape design, or it could be through a physical buffer such as another building. So if you're 100 meters away, but there's a building between you and the roadway that's causing the pollution risk, that would cover you as a buffer. Or you can be 3.5 meters or more above the road level. So those are the 3 pathway options. And it also applies to outdoor amenity spaces. So designing the amenity spaces to be buffered from the major roadway pollution. So, and then the demonstration is basically identifying where the possible locations are. So, it could be as simple as saying, we're a 7-story building and we're planning to have our fresh air intake on the roof, or we're planning to have our fresh air intake at the rear of the building so that we have a buffer, or it's behind this landscape feature. It's simply a description, and it's not necessarily what's the final location of your fresh air intake. Oh, I'm missing my slide on. There is an exemption for this requirement if you are designing a residential building that has individual fresh air intakes for individual suites. You don't need to comply with the metric. So, and that's to prioritize, suite to suite improvements, because there's interior risks of pollution as well as exterior risks of pollution. Yes, it does. Yeah, so it would only be fresh air intakes that are delivering air to occupied spaces. Yeah. Yeah, there's not a lot of point in for the space that is car pollution, car air pollution in and of itself.
Okay.
Yeah. 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 So then now we're getting into the ecology metrics. So the first one is for tree planting. And so this one applies to both site plan and plan of subdivision. So there's a requirement for minimum soil volumes now for trees. So projects must demonstrate 30 meters cubed, high quality soil for street trees. So really demonstrating you're not putting the trees in highly compacted soil, and you're making sure they have access to sufficient soil to grow to their full potential. And then the checklist for this is just a reference to your landscape designs, which would sort of demonstrate, here's an example building, you demonstrate, you know, your trees are, actually, do I have a little pointer thing? So if you have a tree here, you're measuring, you know, what's your horizontal area, and then it's about a meter down in terms of depth to get your 45 meters cubed. So that would be more than enough to accommodate a tree. It's an example site. This is from an Ottawa Community Housing real submission.
It's don't battle with that, right?
Yeah.
Don't think about the trees, but yet they show that, all right, well, we got so much tree emission, right?
Yeah, like trees have a lot of benefits. On a building site, the carbon capture benefits of individual trees relative to the carbon emissions getting put into that building for construction and for operations, they like it's not on par at like it's not having gonna have a measurable impact. The benefits of trees really, like from a climate change perspective, really come from what the resiliency benefits are. And that's not to say that carbon emissions aren't, that the fact that they absorb carbon emissions isn't important. It's just that, you know, a couple of trees on a site isn't going to offset the whole site's carbon emissions. So we don't really factor that into the calculation. Yeah, there's probably a few hundred trees going into the building just from the wood and the other resources going in.
It's always a thing from last team, add more trees, add more trees.
Yeah.
It's more cost to the owners, right?
Yeah.
But it's gotta be a benefit to some point. It's nice
Yeah.
to make it free, and I'm pretty happy, and I want to put more trees if I can.
Yeah.
But there's never any credit provided on that.
Yeah, and like the energy analysis wouldn't
Oh,
be having that weighting. And then this is just sort of demonstrating what 30 meters cubed of soil really looks like and how it can really impact. It's sort of a direct correlation between what your potential ground area is to soil volume. So it's a really important component of ensuring healthy trees. The next ecology metric is for both site plan and plan of subdivision. It relates to plant species. So landscape plans are to include no invasive species and target a minimum of 50% native plant species and preference towards drought tolerant and pollinator friendly plant species. And if you're adjacent to a vegetated buffer, so a buffer along sort of naturalized space, such as a river or preserved forest land, that kind of thing, then the buffer must be 100% native vegetation.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Because with the climate change, the planting zones is changing. So I'm not sure if the native vegetation will remain native, if you see what I'm saying. So
I see what you're saying.
where does that fit in with the long-term plan?
That's an excellent question, and I am not the person to answer that, so I can take note of it and follow up with you with our forestry and sort of experts on that side, because my expertise is not in native species. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's something that will evolve over time, most likely. And then the demonstration for this is reference to the landscape plan and identification of which species are native. So this is planting schedule. It's what they typically look like, and it's just identifying yes or no if it's a native species or not. The next requirement is for site plan for exterior lighting. All exterior light fixtures will be dark sky compliant, full cutoff, and no uplighting unless there's an exemption. Dark sky compliant must have the full seal of approval. So, and that's really aimed at addressing that bird safe requirements. So, and it's a pretty simple documentation of just commitment to have that, and then references on your landscape drawings if you have exterior lighting that's applicable. The next metric is for bird safe design. So for mid to high rise residential, medium to large scale commercial, industrial, and institutional buildings must use bird safe specified glass for 90% of the lower areas of the building and in areas that are directly adjacent to vegetated roof space. So it's for the first 16 meters of height or to the height of the adjacent mature tree canopy, whichever is greater, as well as eliminating fly-through effects. So those kind of corner buildings, or you had a pathway that's all glazed, you'd have to consider that fly-through risk for birds. And then the documentation for this is identifying what your glazing areas are and which areas are getting treated to demonstrate you're hitting that 90% number. And so this is an example building that kind of shows you what this would mean. All the aqua blue highlighted windows are within that 16 meters above grade, and would have to have bird safe treatment as well. If you had a rooftop garden area, terrace area here, anything in that immediate area would also need to be treated with bird safe glass. So site plan for sustainable roofing, we have a requirement for all flat roofs that are over 500 meters squared. They must provide either a green roof, cool roof, or a combination of sustainable roofing measures to hit the threshold. So for green roof, it's 50% of available roof space. And if it's accessible, like accessible green roof area, you can up the value of that roof space by 20%. So 100 meters of accessible green roof would be counted as 120 meters of 120 square meters of accessible roof area. And for cool roof areas, it would be 90% of the available roof space. And if the roof is over 2,500 meters squared, a minimum of 1,000 meters squared of the roof area needs to be designated solar ready. So I'd considering how you might install a future solar installation. And cool roof is defined as a solar reflective index value of 64 for the 3-year aged, or 0.65 for the initial solar reflectance. And then the third option is a combination of green roof of at least 2 of the following strategies. So green roof, cool roof, solar PV for at least 75% of the available roof space. And this is just some examples. So this would be some white roofing. This is some examples of solar PV. This is an example of a combination where the lower podium roofs are green and the upper roofs are white. And then this is some of the details. So of how we're defining solar ready and how we're defining available roof space. So of particular note, available roof space is considered roof space that is not otherwise occupied by mechanical or electrical equipment. So to exclude your cooling tower and those kinds of features. And then this is the details of how we're defining solar ready. So we have a list of 4 requirements and then 2 recommendations. And then a few different examples. Essentially, the documentation for this is just identifying on the plan what your roof areas are, what the various treatments are, and then submitting the areas into the form to do the calculation of what your percentage that you're hitting is. And so on the form, you only need to hit one of the 3 option pathways. And this is just more examples. I don't think I need to go into that level of detail. So the next metric is for cool landscape and paving. So there's 2 options here. Either the soft landscaping area exceeds the minimum zoning by 20%, or you're treating some of your sites non-roof hardscape. So 50% of your sites non-roof hardscape. So treatment of that could be through reflective paving materials, open grid pavement with 50% perviousness, shade from newer existing tree canopy, and for new, it's within 10 years of growth, or within a 10-year growth projection. Shade from structures with energy generation, so parking lot solar panels is an example. And for parking areas, rather than doing a shade calculation, you could, there's an alternative option to install 1 tree for every 5 parking spaces to sort of have a proxy of what would provide shading for parking lots, at-grade parking lots. So non-roof hardscapes includes driveways, walkways, courtyards, surface parking areas, as well as artificial turf, and any other hard surface areas. Industrial work yards or similar areas that might have sort of limitations around them like that can be excluded from the hard surface calculation. And this is just some images of some example strategies and examples of how you might mark up your site plan to demonstrate what your various solutions are. So on the form is just either demonstrating a greater than 100% of the minimum zoning requirement, or calculation of that you're treating 50% of the paved area. The next metric is common area waste storage. So design and construct the property to have sufficient waste collection to accommodate recycling, organic, and garbage as required with zoning and the multi-unit residential solid waste collection design guidelines. And it's just a manner of identifying what the area that's designated for that storage is. Electric vehicle parking. So this is one that's references the zoning bylaw, but the zoning bylaw is under review right now. So the requirement when the high performance development standard comes into effect is to report on electric vehicle parking, what's being provided, but there isn't a requirement to provide various, like a specific level. The direction we've received is that the zoning bylaw update will include provisions for that. So that'll be coming in the next couple of years, but it's not a requirement immediately. And consideration for EV charging can be EV capable, so the power supply is there, but you don't have outlets to the individual parking spaces. It can be EV ready, so you have the outlets to the parking spaces, but not an actual charger or fully EV installed. And that would be if you have the actual charger fully installed. And so it's a reporting requirement only to begin with. And similarly, bike parking, we reference the zoning bylaw, and it's a reporting requirement only to begin with, and those requirements might change. So that's it. Those are, so it's well, I guess we're breaking now, but thank you for the time. And this is, if you want more information, the website's up here as well as our general staff email. Yeah. Yeah. We are going through just minor updates in relation particularly to the conversation we had earlier on that the energy modeling report is now getting deferred as a condition to site plan approval. So we have to update the forms to make that clear. So we're waiting to do that before we distribute it broadly, but it's coming. And yeah. All right. Great. Thanks, guys. I guess I can stop share.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Much appreciated. We'll now break for lunch and it's a buffet stop. And we'll be back. Let's aim for 30 minutes. So let's say 1:45 to be back. Seems like it should be enough time. And we'll see you then. Thank you.